Good evening, and welcome to Just About History. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, pull the blanket a little closer, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take one slow breath in, and let it go. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. No decisions to make, no problems to solve. Tonight, all you have to do is listen. And tonight's story is one of the most haunting, most human, and most heartbreaking things that history has ever quietly tucked away. It is a story about children, about faith so fierce it moved thousands of young feet across mountains and deserts and coastlines, about a world so desperate, so raw, so saturated with God and fear and hunger, that a young boy standing in a field claiming Christ had spoken to him was not considered a madman. He was considered a messenger. This is the story of the Children's Crusade. But before we can understand what happened in the summer of 1212, we need to go further back, much further. We need to understand the world these children were born into, because without that world, without its smell and its texture and its specific grinding terror, nothing that follows will make any sense at all. So dim the lights if you haven't already, maybe put on a soft fan, or let the night settle around you. And if you are enjoying what we do here at Just About History, take just a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you might think. And drop your location and your local time in the comments below. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people all over the world are settling in at the same time, listening to the same story. You might even help a fellow insomniac find their way here tonight. Now, let's go back. Let's go back to a world without electric light. This sounds like a small thing until you truly sit with it. In the medieval European countryside of the early 13th century, when the sun went down, the world went dark. Not the soft urban dark we know today, pierced by streetlights and phone screens and the distant glow of a city on the horizon. True dark, the kind of dark where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The kind of dark where the forest at the edge of the village was not just a forest, it was a wall, a boundary, the edge of the known world, and beyond it lived things that had no names in any language you wanted to say out loud. This darkness shaped everything. It shaped when people slept, how they prayed, what they feared. It shaped the rhythm of entire civilizations. Life organized itself around the sun in a way that is almost impossible for a modern person to fully feel. You woke when it was light because you had to. You worked until the light failed because there was no other choice. And when night came, you were very, very small. The average peasant in early 13th century France or Germany, the people whose children would eventually march south toward the Mediterranean dreaming of Jerusalem, lived a life of almost incomprehensible hardship by modern standards. Not hardship in the dramatic, cinematic sense, not the hardship of battles and sieges, though those came too. The quiet, grinding, daily hardship of a body that was always slightly hungry, always slightly cold, always slightly tired, and always entirely uncertain about tomorrow. A peasant family in this era typically lived in a single-room structure. Stone if they were fortunate, which most were not. More commonly it was a timber frame packed with wattle, a mixture of woven branches and mud and dung, with a thatched roof that leaked when it rained and harboured insects and small animals year-round. The floor was earth. The bed, if it could be called that, was a pile of straw that was shared by the entire family and sometimes by the livestock as well, because in winter the body heat of animals was not a comfort but a survival strategy. There was a fire, almost always a fire, burning in a central hearth with no chimney, just a hole in the roof that let out some of the smoke and kept in most of the warmth. The walls were permanently blackened. The lungs of everyone who lived inside were permanently irritated. Respiratory illness was so common it barely registered as illness. It was simply the texture of breathing. Food was bread. Almost always bread. Dark, dense, gritty bread made from rye or barley or whatever grain had survived the last harvest. In good years there was also pottage, a thick porridge of boiled vegetables and grains that sat in a pot over the fire for days, sometimes weeks, being added to and eaten from in a continuous cycle. Meat was a luxury for feast days and slaughter season. Fruit was seasonal and precious. Sugar was essentially unknown to anyone outside of noble households. Salt was expensive enough to be fought over. And then there were the bad years. Famine in medieval Europe was not a distant news story. It was a physical reality that arrived with terrifying regularity. A wet summer that rotted the grain in the fields, a dry spring that stunted the crop before it could fruit, an early frost, a late frost, a plague of rats in the granary. Any one of these, and an entire village tipped from subsistence into starvation. People ate bark. They ate leather. They ate things that do not need to be named here. Children were the first to die, and the last to be admitted to be dying, because a parent's instinct to pretend the situation was not as bad as it was ran directly against the reality of a child's shrinking body. This is the soil from which the Children's Crusade grew. Not metaphorically. Literally, these were the children of people who had watched siblings die of hunger, who had buried parents before 40, who had stood in fields and prayed with a desperation that we, comfortable fed, with medicine and weather forecasts and grocery stores, genuinely cannot access from the inside. But hunger alone does not explain it. To understand why thousands of children followed a boy preacher toward the sea, you need to understand the other great force shaping every single life in medieval Europe. The Church. Today, when we talk about religion being important to a society, we generally mean that a significant number of people attend services and consider faith a meaningful part of their personal identity. We mean something private and chosen, something that coexists alongside secular education and science and government and 100 other competing frameworks for understanding the world. This is not what the Church meant in 1212. In early 13th century Europe, the Catholic Church was not one institution among many. It was the total architecture of reality. It was the explanation for everything that happened and the framework within which every decision, personal, political, agricultural, military, was made. There was no government that did not ultimately answer to Rome. There was no education that was not administered by the Church. There was no medicine that did not incorporate prayer as a primary treatment. There was no calendar that was not structured around saints' days and liturgical seasons. There was no map of the cosmos that did not place God at the centre and hell at the edges. The average medieval peasant child grew up inside this framework completely and without any exterior reference point from which to question it. They did not know about other religious traditions in any meaningful way. They did not have access to philosophical texts that raised doubts. They did not have a printing press, a school system, or a neighbour who had been to university. What they had was the local parish priest, who was often barely literate himself, and the enormous, gorgeous, terrifying visual theology of the Church. The painted saints on the walls, the crucifix above the altar, the annual drama of Easter and Christmas, played out in gesture and Latin, that they could hear but not understand. And what this total, immersive, inescapable church told them every single day of their lives was this: the world is a battleground between God and the devil, your soul is the prize, suffering in this life is temporary and meaningful, obedience and faith will be rewarded. And Jerusalem, the holy city where Christ walked and died and rose, is in the hands of people who should not have it. This last point requires some unpacking, because it is the specific wound from which everything that follows bleeds. Jerusalem had been captured by Muslim forces in 637 AD, more than 5 centuries before our story begins. For most of that time, Christian pilgrims had been permitted to travel to the holy sites more or less peacefully under various Islamic administrations. There was trade, there was coexistence, there was a complicated and often functional relationship between Christian Europe and the Islamic world that history has largely buried under the more dramatic narrative of conflict. Then, in 1095, everything changed. Pope Urban II stood up at the Council of Clermont in France and delivered what is arguably the most consequential speech in medieval history. We do not have his exact words. Different chroniclers recorded different versions, but the substance is clear. He told the assembled clergy and knights that the Holy Land was suffering, that Christians in the East were being persecuted, that the sacred sites of Jerusalem were defiled, and that God was calling the warriors of Europe to take up arms and reclaim them. He promised that anyone who died on this mission would have their sins remitted entirely. He promised that the journey itself was an act of penance so powerful it could wipe a soul clean. The crowd reportedly responded with a single roar, Deus Vult. God wills it. What followed was the First Crusade, and against almost all reasonable expectation, it worked. In 1099, Crusader forces captured Jerusalem. They massacred a substantial portion of the city's population, Muslim, Jewish and Christian alike, in the chaos of the assault, and established a series of Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land that became known collectively as Outremer, a French word meaning simply beyond the sea. For the people of Europe, this was not a military campaign. It was a miracle. God had moved through human hands. The impossible had been made possible by faith. And the lesson that was drawn from this, the lesson that was repeated from every pulpit in every parish across the continent for the next century, was that God rewards those who act in his name with sufficient faith and sufficient sacrifice. This lesson would echo for generations. It would be the lesson ringing in the ears of every child who picked up a walking stick in 1212 and began moving south. Because the crusading movement did not end with the First Crusade. It could not. The kingdoms of Outremer were perpetually under pressure, perpetually short of men and money, perpetually teetering on the edge of collapse. The Second Crusade was called in 1147 and ended in humiliating failure. The Third Crusade, the famous one, the one with Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, was called in 1189 after Jerusalem fell again to Saladin's forces in 1187 and produced a negotiated Axis agreement, but not a reconquest. The Fourth Crusade, called in 1202, ended in one of the most bizarre misdirections in military history, when the crusading army, deep in debt to Venetian merchants, ended up sacking the Christian city of Constantinople instead of going anywhere near Jerusalem. By the time 1212 arrived, the crusading movement was more than a century old. It had become part of the cultural atmosphere of Europe in the way that certain ideas become so embedded they no longer feel like ideas, they feel like facts. The Holy Land was a wound. Jerusalem was a debt. God was waiting. These were not theological propositions that educated men debated in universities. They were the emotional weather of daily life for ordinary people, felt in the gut, absorbed through the skin as natural and unavoidable as the smell of the seasons. And there was something else building by 1212, something specific to this moment that distinguished it from all the previous decades of crusading fervour. The official crusades had been failing, and the Church, struggling to explain these failures to a population that had been told God rewards faith, had developed a theory. The crusades failed, the theory went, because the people leading them were not pure enough. The knights and nobles and kings who took the cross were too interested in land and wealth and glory. Their faith was contaminated by ambition. God was not blessing their campaigns because God was waiting for something purer. This theory, circulating widely in sermons and popular literature by the early 13th century, had an implication that nobody stated out loud, but that everyone could feel pressing against the edges of the idea. If the powerful and corrupted had failed to reclaim Jerusalem, perhaps the task required someone uncorrupted, someone without wealth or ambition or political calculation, someone whose faith was simple and total and utterly without guile, someone like a child. To understand how seriously medieval people took this idea, you need to understand their conception of childhood, which was radically different from ours. We live in a world that places enormous cultural value on childhood as a protected state. Children are innocent, we believe, and that innocence must be guarded and extended as long as possible. Childhood is preparation for life, a period of learning and play deliberately insulated from adult responsibilities and adult truths. Medieval Europe did not share this view, not in any meaningful practical sense. A child in a peasant household in 1212 was working by the age of 5 or 6, not in a symbolic educational way, actually working, tending animals, carrying water, gathering fuel, processing food. By 10 or 12, a boy was expected to contribute substantially to the household's survival. By 14 or 15, many were already married or apprenticed or working full-time in whatever trade or agricultural role their community required of them. Childhood as we understand it simply did not exist as a prolonged protected phase. The transition from child to adult was not a gradual psychological and social process supervised by therapists and educators. It was an economic reality that arrived early and hard. And yet, and this is the tension at the heart of what we are about to explore, the Church simultaneously held children in a particular spiritual regard. Not as innocent in the modern sentimental sense, but as spiritually uncontaminated in a specific theological sense. Children who died before reaching the age of reason were considered to bypass purgatory entirely. The prayers of children were considered especially pure, their faith less muddied by the compromises and corruptions that adult life inevitably introduced. A child who demonstrated unusual piety or who claimed divine visions was not automatically dismissed. In a world saturated with miracle stories, in a religious culture that accepted direct divine communication as a real and ongoing phenomenon, a child who said God had spoken to him was taken seriously in a way that requires a genuine imaginative leap to understand from our current vantage point. Visions were real. Miracles were real. God intervened in human affairs continuously and concretely. These were not metaphors for medieval people. They were the operating assumptions of daily life. And so when a young shepherd boy stood up in a field in France in the spring of 1212 and claimed that Jesus Christ had appeared to him disguised as a pilgrim and handed him a letter to deliver to the King of France, the people around him did not laugh. They listened. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Before we arrive at Stephen of Cloyes and his letter from Christ, we need to spend a little more time in the world that received him, because the specific social and political tensions of 1212 matter enormously to understanding why his message found such fertile ground so quickly. The early 13th century was a period of unusual turbulence even by medieval standards. The papacy under Innocent III, one of the most powerful and ambitious popes in the Church's history, was engaged in a simultaneous effort to reform the Church, suppress heresy, launch new crusades, and assert papal authority over the increasingly fractious kingdoms of Europe. It was an era of enormous institutional energy and enormous institutional anxiety, a moment when the Church felt both more powerful and more threatened than it had in generations. The specific heresy that was consuming the most attention in France in this period was Catharism, a dualist Christian movement centred in the south of France, particularly in the region of Languedoc, that had attracted enormous popular following among ordinary people precisely because it offered a simpler, purer, more personally accessible spiritual life than the increasingly complex and politically entangled official church. The Cathars believed in a sharp distinction between the material world, which they considered the creation of an evil or lesser god, and the spiritual world, which was the realm of the true God. They rejected many of the sacraments. They rejected the authority of Rome. They lived simply and austerely, and their preachers, called perfecti, walked among ordinary people barefoot and poor, in stark contrast to the wealthy, land-owning, politically connected clergy of the official church. Innocent III had tried persuasion and then diplomacy, and then increasingly aggressive ecclesiastical pressure, and none of it had worked. In 1208 he finally called a crusade against the Cathars, the Albigensian Crusade, and northern French knights poured south into Languedoc in what became one of the most violent suppression campaigns of the medieval period, with massacres of entire towns and a level of brutality that shocked even contemporary observers. The Albigensian Crusade was still in full violent progress in 1212, and its existence as a backdrop to the Children's Crusade is important for a specific reason. It demonstrated, viscerally and recently, that the crusading impulse was not just an overseas adventure. It was a live, active force that the Church was willing to direct in any direction it chose against any target it designated as an enemy of God. The machinery of holy war was running. Everyone could hear it. Against this backdrop of religious warfare to the south and crusading failure in the east, the popular piety of ordinary French and German peasants was under unusual pressure. The official channels for expressing that piety, the parish church, the sacraments, the established pilgrimage routes, were increasingly felt by some to be inadequate, corrupted, or inaccessible. There was a hunger in the popular religious imagination that the institution was not satisfying. Into this hunger stepped the wandering preachers. Popular preaching was a phenomenon that the Church both depended on and deeply feared. Depended on because the institutional clergy could not possibly reach every village, every hamlet, every isolated farmstead on the continent. Feared because an untrained, unauthorized preacher, answering only to his own sense of divine calling, was an ecclesiastical loose cannon, potentially inspiring, potentially heretical, and almost impossible to control once a crowd had formed around him. The early 13th century was full of them. Some became saints. Francis of Assisi, perhaps the most beloved figure in Catholic history, began his ministry in this same period, wandering barefoot through the Italian countryside, preaching to birds and beggars and lepers, gathering followers through the sheer magnetic force of his radical poverty and his seemingly genuine joy. His movement would become the Franciscan order, officially sanctioned by Rome in 1209. But in his early years he was simply another unauthorized wandering preacher in a landscape full of them, and the institutional church watched him nervously before deciding he was an asset rather than a threat. Not all wandering preachers got that resolution. Many were condemned. Many were ignored. Many gathered brief, intense followings that dissipated when the preacher moved on or fell ill, or simply proved less miraculous than advertised. But in 1212, two of them did not dissipate. In France there was Stephen, In Germany there was Nicholas. And the movements that gathered around them, chaotic, desperate, burning with faith, and marching toward a sea that would not part, would become one of the most discussed and most debated episodes in the entire history of the crusading movement. Let us stay a little longer in this world before we follow them. Because there is one more piece of the context that matters, and it is the piece that is most difficult to communicate to a modern audience, precisely because it is the most foreign to our experience. The medieval relationship to death was completely different from ours. We live in a culture that largely hides death. Our dying happens in hospitals and care facilities, behind closed doors, managed by professionals. The body is prepared out of sight, presented briefly, and disposed of according to rituals designed to be as painless and contained as possible. Death is something that happens to other people until quite suddenly it doesn't, and most of us spend the great majority of our lives at a comfortable remove from its physical reality. In 1212, death was furniture. It was everywhere, all the time, at every age. Infant mortality was staggering, depending on the region and the period. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of children born did not reach their 5th birthday. Not from dramatic causes, mostly from diarrhea, from infections that a modern doctor could clear in 3 days with a course of antibiotics, from the simple, quiet failure of a small body that did not have enough food or warmth or clean water to sustain itself. Those who survived childhood then faced the ordinary gauntlet of adult medieval life, agricultural accidents, infected wounds, childbirth for women, malnutrition during bad harvests, epidemics of diseases we have mostly forgotten, and the background radiation of violence that characterized a society where legal systems were weak, laws were often arbitrary, and disputes were frequently resolved by whoever had the larger stick. The average life expectancy in this period is a number historians debate, but the texture of it is clear from the records. Not many people grew old. Not many people had the experience, common today even in relatively poor countries, of living long enough to watch their children grow up and have children of their own and grow old themselves. Life was short, uncertain, and saturated with loss. What this produced, in combination with the Church's total framing of reality, was a particular relationship to death that sounds strange to modern ears, but was completely natural to the people living it. A genuine belief that death was not the worst thing that could happen to you, and might in fact be among the better outcomes if it came in service of God. This is not a metaphor. Medieval people genuinely believed in an afterlife with a concreteness that we struggle to access. Not as a comforting philosophical position, not as a cultural inheritance held loosely and rarely examined, as a physical certainty, as real as the ground underfoot. Heaven was a place you went. Hell was a place you went. Purgatory was a place where the not quite holy and not quite damned waited in a state of painful purification. The Church had an elaborate system for navigating these destinations, sacraments and indulgences and prayers and masses and pilgrimages, all with specific, documented spiritual effects on your soul's trajectory. And a crusade, dying in service of reclaiming the Holy Land, came with the most powerful spiritual technology available. Full remission of sins. A direct pass through purgatory. The closest thing the medieval world had to a guaranteed ticket. For a peasant child who had grown up watching people die young and painfully, who had been told every Sunday that this life was temporary and the next was eternal, who had no property and no prospects and no power and nothing to lose. The proposition of the crusade was not obviously insane. It was a transaction. It was the only transaction available to someone at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy that offered any return at all. This is the world. muddy and dark and saturated with God and stinking of smoke and ringing with the prayers of people who genuinely, deeply, completely believed that the next step after this life was either eternal bliss or eternal torment, and who would do almost anything to secure the former. Into this world, in the spring of 1212, came a boy with a letter. His name was Stephen, and he was from the village of Cloyes-sur-le-Loire in the French region of Vendée. We know almost nothing certain about him. His age is variously given as 12 or thereabouts, though some sources suggest he may have been older, perhaps in his mid-teens. He is described by chroniclers as a shepherd boy, which places him firmly in the peasant class, likely illiterate, certainly without any formal religious education or clerical standing. What we know is what he claimed, and what he claimed was extraordinary even by the standards of a world that took extraordinary claims seriously. He said that while he was tending his flock, a pilgrim had approached him, an ordinary-looking traveller, staff in hand, dusty from the road. The pilgrim had asked Stephen for bread, which Stephen had given him, and then the pilgrim had revealed himself to be Jesus Christ, had handed Stephen a letter addressed to the King of France, and had instructed him to preach a new crusade. A crusade of the poor, a crusade of children, a crusade of the pure in heart who would succeed where the compromised and the corrupted had failed. The pilgrim Christ then vanished. Stephen had his mission. Now, before we go any further, it is worth pausing on what a modern person's first instinct is when they hear this story, because that instinct is worth examining. The modern instinct is probably something like he made it up, or he was disturbed, or he was manipulated by someone with a political agenda. These are all reasonable hypotheses, and historians have explored all of them. We will examine them in detail as we go. But it is important to also sit with the possibility that Stephen believed every word of what he said. That he had an experience, a dream, a vision, a moment of intense religious emotion while alone in a field that his entire cultural framework told him could only mean one thing, and that he reported that experience with complete sincerity, because the medieval world was full of people who had visions, who dreamed of saints, who felt the presence of God in physical, visceral, overwhelming ways that their culture validated and their community affirmed. Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen, mystical experience was not the fringe of medieval religion. It was woven into its centre. A 12-year-old boy alone in a field, hungry, tired, saturated from birth, in a religious culture that expected and celebrated direct divine communication, could very plausibly have had an experience that he experienced as genuine and reported as genuine. Whether it was genuine in the theological sense is a question this channel is not equipped to answer. What matters for our purposes is that he believed it, and that what came next suggests that a great many other people believed it too. Stephen did not go quietly to the king's court with his letter and wait patiently for an audience. He began to preach. He stood in marketplaces and on roadsides and outside churches after Mass, and he spoke, and by all accounts he was extraordinarily good at it. The chronicles describe him with a consistency that suggests something real about his gifts. He was charismatic, he was passionate, his voice carried, and he said things that resonated in ways that scholarly sermons delivered in Latin did not. What did he say? The details vary across sources, but the core message was consistent. God was calling the poor and the young and the pure to do what the powerful and the corrupt had failed to do. Jerusalem could be reclaimed not by armies and siege engines and political manoeuvring, but by faith alone. The sea would part for them as it had parted for Moses, because God rewarded pure faith with miracles. And Stephen himself, small, poor, illiterate, standing in a dusty marketplace with a letter from Christ, was the proof that God worked through the humble. This message landed. It landed hard and fast, and with a velocity that suggests it was striking something that had been under pressure for a very long time. People began to follow him, at first in ones and twos, then in dozens, then in hundreds. Not just children. The sources make clear that the movement attracted a mixed crowd of young people, poor adults, women, wanderers, the marginalised and the hopeless of all ages. But children, particularly adolescent boys, were prominent and numerous enough that the movement acquired the name that has followed it through history. By the time Stephen arrived at Venmi, the location he had designated as a gathering point, probably because it was a known pilgrimage site and a place where large crowds were not unusual, the chronicles report numbers that strain credibility. 30,000. Some say more. These medieval crowd estimates are almost certainly inflated, as medieval crowd estimates always are, but the underlying reality they gesture at is clear. Something enormous was happening. We will follow Stephen and his crowd to Venmi, and then to Paris, and then to the sea in the chapters ahead. But for now, for tonight, let this image settle. A summer field in France. The year 1212. Thousands of people, children, peasants, wanderers, believers, gathered around a boy who said Christ had spoken to him, dusty and hungry and burning with faith and absolutely certain that God was about to do something impossible on their behalf. The world that made this possible was a world of darkness and hunger and total, immersive, all-encompassing belief. A world where the distance between the human and the divine was very small, where miracles were expected, and where the worst thing you could do was not believe enough. These children believed enough. They believed with everything they had. And the world, as it so often does with that kind of belief, was about to be very unkind to them. It was summer in France. The fields were dry and golden, the roads were dust, and a boy named Stephen was standing in a marketplace somewhere in the Loire Valley, preaching to anyone who would stop and listen. And people were stopping. People were listening. People were walking away from their villages and their chores and their ordinary desperate lives, and falling in behind him, because what he was saying reached into something that the official church, with all its Latin and its politics and its distant gilded altars, had somehow failed to touch. We are going to follow Stephen now. We are going to follow him through the weeks of his preaching tour, through the enormous gathering at Venmi, through his rejected audience with the King of France, and then south toward Marseille, toward the sea, toward the moment when everything his movement had built itself upon would be tested against the simple physical reality of water that did not part. But before we do, let us spend a moment with the boy himself, because Stephen of Cloyes is one of those historical figures who exists almost entirely in the accounts of people who either admired him enormously or dismissed him completely, and the truth of who he was sits somewhere in the uncomfortable space between those two versions. The village of Cloyes-sur-Loire is a small place on the Loire River in the Venmi region of north-central France. It is small today. It was small in 1212. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the rhythms of the agricultural year governed everything, where the arrival of a travelling merchant or a wandering friar was an event worth talking about for weeks. Stephen grew up there, the son of a peasant family whose name history has not preserved. He was a shepherd boy, which means that from a very young age he spent long hours alone in fields, watching animals, with nothing to occupy his mind but the sky and the seasons, and the rich interior life that solitude tends to generate in children with active imaginations. He could not read. He had no formal education of any kind. What he knew of the world he knew from what he heard at Mass, what he was told by adults, and what he observed with his own eyes in the limited geography of a small French village and its surrounding farmland. This background matters because it tells us something about the nature of his gift. Whatever Stephen had, it was not learned or rehearsed or developed through study. It was raw. It was instinctive. It was the kind of natural oratory that occasionally emerges from people who have never been taught to speak formally precisely because they have never been taught to speak formally, unpolished, direct, emotionally immediate, free of the hedging and qualifying that education tends to introduce. The chroniclers who describe his preaching use words that cluster around a specific quality. They do not describe him as learned or sophisticated. They describe him as compelling, fervent, possessed by a fire that communicated itself to crowds without apparent effort. One account describes people weeping as they listened to him. Another describes the crowd pressing forward to touch him as though physical contact might transmit some of the grace they felt radiating from his words. This is the language the medieval world used for genuine charisma. It is also, it should be said, the language the medieval world used for calculating manipulation. The two were not always distinguishable from the outside, and historians have argued about which category Stephen belongs to for centuries. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: Stephen of Cloyes, in the spring and early summer of 1212, found himself at the centre of something much larger than himself. Whether he engineered that or stumbled into it, whether he fully understood what he was doing or was as swept up in the momentum as everyone around him, is a question the evidence does not resolve. What the evidence shows is what he did and where it led. After his vision in the field, the Pilgrim Christ, the letter, the mission, Stephen did not immediately start a mass movement. The early stages were more modest than the later legends suggest. He began, it seems, by doing what any devout medieval person would do with a message from God. He tried to deliver it through proper channels. The letter, Stephen claimed, was addressed to the King of France. In 1212, that was Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, one of the most capable and politically sophisticated monarchs in French history. Philip had been king since 1180, and had transformed France from a patchwork of feudal territories into something approaching a coherent, centralized kingdom. He was shrewd, unsentimental, and not much given to mystical enthusiasm. Stephen apparently made his way to the royal court. The sources are vague about exactly when and how, and sought an audience. The image is almost unbearably poignant when you sit with it. A peasant shepherd boy, probably barefoot, almost certainly travel-worn, carrying a letter he could not read addressed to a king he had never met, trying to navigate the protocols and gatekeepers of a royal court in order to deliver a message from Jesus Christ. We do not know if he got as far as Philip himself, or was turned away by courtiers before he got anywhere near the king. What we know is the outcome. Philip, or his representatives, dismissed Stephen, sent him away. The royal court of France had no interest in the visions of an illiterate shepherd boy from the Loire Valley, however sincere his conviction. This dismissal could have ended the story entirely. Many popular religious movements of this period sputtered and died at exactly this kind of obstacle. The loss of official validation leaving the founder without the institutional backing necessary to sustain momentum. But Stephen did something that transformed his rejection into rocket fuel. He took his message to the people directly. The decision, if it was a conscious decision and not simply the natural next step for someone with no other options, was strategically brilliant, whether or not Stephen understood it as strategy. Because the official channels had just rejected him, and the official channels were exactly what his message was critiquing. His entire proposition was that God was bypassing the powerful and the established in favour of the humble and the pure. The king's dismissal did not undermine this message. It confirmed it. Stephen began preaching in earnest. He moved through the towns and villages of the Loire Valley and the surrounding regions, stopping in marketplaces, in churchyards, outside monastery walls, at crossroads where travellers gathered. He spoke about Jerusalem. He spoke about the failure of the great Crusades. He spoke about the purity of the poor and the corruption of the powerful. And he spoke about his vision, the pilgrim Christ, the letter, the mission, with a simplicity and a conviction that cut through the noise of daily medieval life like a blade. He also, the sources tell us, performed miracles. Or rather, and this distinction matters, people in the crowds around him reported witnessing miracles. The healing of sick children, the curing of blindness, objects moving without being touched. These reports spread ahead of him as he travelled, so that by the time he arrived in a new town, crowds were already waiting, already primed by stories of what had happened in the last place he preached. Now, a 21st century reader's instinct here is to reach immediately for the word fabricated, and it is certainly possible, probable even, that at least some of these miracle reports were exaggerated, misinterpreted, or simply invented by people whose desire to believe was stronger than their critical faculties. The medieval world's standards of evidence for miracles were not our standards, but it is also worth noting that mass religious movements throughout history have consistently generated reports of unusual experiences in crowds, emotional healings, psychosomatic recoveries, moments of collective euphoria that observers interpreted through whatever spiritual framework they had available. These experiences are real, even when their interpretation is contested. The people who reported being healed in Stephen's presence were not, in most cases, lying. They were reporting their experience accurately within their own framework. What is certain is that the miracle reports accelerated the movement dramatically. By the time Stephen arrived at Venmaye, which he had designated as the gathering point for his crusade, probably in late June or early July of 1212, something extraordinary had already happened. The road to Venmaye was full of people coming to meet him. Venmaye was a town Stephen likely chose for specific practical reasons. It was a known pilgrimage site, associated with the Holy Tear of Venmaye, a relic purportedly containing a tear shed by Christ at the tomb of Lazarus, brought to France from the Holy Land. It was therefore already a place where large crowds gathering for religious purposes was normal and expected, where the infrastructure of pilgrimage, inns, food sellers, water sources could absorb at least some of an unusual influx. It was also roughly central to the regions where Stephen had been preaching, accessible by the major roads of northern France without requiring a journey so long that it would deter people from attempting it. The chronicles describe what gathered at Venmaye in terms that remain staggering even with all appropriate scepticism about medieval crowd estimates. 30,000 is the number that appears most frequently, though some accounts go higher. Even if the real number was a fraction of this, even if it was 5,000 or 10,000, it was an enormous gathering for the time and place. The town itself could not have contained them. People camped in the fields outside, along the river, on every available piece of flat ground. And who were they? This is where the popular image of the Children's Crusade, a column of innocent children marching innocently toward the sea, begins to complicate itself when you look at the actual sources. The crowd at Venmaye was not composed exclusively, or even primarily, of young children. It was a mixed movement of the poor and the marginal. There were adolescent boys, certainly, many of them. There were girls too, though the sources mention them less frequently and with more discomfort, suggesting that female participation was noted as unusual and somewhat troubling to male chroniclers. There were young adults, men and women in their late teens and early 20s. There were older poor people, the kind of wandering. Rootless poor that medieval society always generated in substantial numbers. People without land, without trade, without prospects, who had been moving along the roads of France long before Stephen came along, and who attached themselves to his movement, because it offered direction and community and a frame of meaning for their wandering. There were also, the sources suggest with considerable distaste, a certain number of people whose motives were less spiritual, petty criminals, prostitutes, the professional marginal, who followed large gatherings of people for the same reason flies follow livestock. The chroniclers who were hostile to the movement, and there were many, emphasized these elements heavily, using them to delegitimize the whole enterprise. The chroniclers who were sympathetic emphasized the children and the genuine piety and tried to draw a clean line between the sincere and the opportunistic. The truth, as it almost always is with mass movements, was probably that both groups were present and intermingled in ways that made clean categories impossible. What happened at Venmi itself is something the sources describe with more enthusiasm than precision. Stephen preached, at length, repeatedly, to the enormous crowd. He stood, some accounts suggest, on a cart, so that he could be seen and heard over the mass of people, and he delivered the message that had drawn them all there. Jerusalem, purity, the sea would part. God was with them, and not with the armies of kings. The crowd responded with what the chronicles describe as extraordinary religious emotion. Weeping, prostration, collective prayer of an intensity that observers found either deeply moving or deeply alarming, depending on their disposition. Other preachers began to speak as well. The movement had by now generated its own secondary figures, followers of Stephen who had taken up his message and were amplifying it through the crowd. Some of these figures the sources name briefly and then lose track of. Others seem to have had genuine independent followings that attached to Stephen's movement, rather than originating from it. The atmosphere at Venmi was, by all accounts, one of total, consuming religious intensity. People had walked for days to be there. They were hungry and tired and overheated in the summer sun, and absolutely certain that they were at the beginning of something miraculous. This combination, physical exhaustion, emotional intensity, collective belief, and the particular electricity of a very large crowd unified around a single purpose, produces states of mind that are difficult to describe and easy to misinterpret in either direction, as either pure spiritual transcendence or pure mass hysteria. The medieval chroniclers who witnessed or heard about Venmi chose their interpretation based almost entirely on their prior attitude toward Stephen. Those who believed in him described a Pentecostal outpouring of divine grace. Those who doubted him described a dangerous mob being manipulated by a charismatic fraud. Both descriptions contain truth. Neither contains all of it. From Venmi, Stephen led his movement north to Paris. This was a logical step. Paris was the seat of royal power, the most important city in France, and Stephen had not yet abandoned his original mission of delivering his letter to the king. Perhaps he believed that arriving at the head of 30,000 people would make the king's court reconsider the dismissal it had given to a solitary shepherd boy. Perhaps he genuinely needed royal sanction to feel that his movement had legitimacy. Perhaps he simply had enough momentum now that stopping in any one place felt impossible. The movement needed to move, and north to Paris was the obvious direction. The sources describe the march to Paris as an event in itself. The long column of people moving through the summer countryside of France attracted attention everywhere it passed. People came out of their villages to watch, and many of them joined. Others watched with alarm a column of thousands of poor. Predominantly young people moving purposefully along the king's roads was not a reassuring sight to settled propertied observers. The authorities of various towns along the route apparently watched nervously and mostly let them pass, calculating that direct confrontation was more dangerous than simply letting the column move on. In Paris, Stephen sought a formal audience with Philip Augustus, and Philip, again, said no. The king consulted with the University of Paris, the great intellectual centre of the age, home to some of the most sophisticated theological minds in Europe. The masters of the university deliberated and issued what amounted to a formal recommendation that the movement be disbanded. Their reasoning was practical and theological simultaneously. The participants were too young, too poor, too inexperienced to undertake a crusade. The enterprise had not been authorized by the Pope. The claims of divine inspiration had not been properly verified by church authorities. The whole thing was imprudent and should be stopped. The word they used, or the word the sources report them using, was puerile, childish, which carries in this context not just the meaning of relating to children, but the contemptuous meaning of foolish and beneath serious consideration. Philip's formal dismissal echoed the university's recommendation. The King of France was not interested in Stephen's letter or Stephen's vision or Stephen's 30,000 followers. He told them to go home. This is the moment in the story where a modern observer might expect the movement to collapse. The king had refused them. The most respected intellectual institution in France had called them foolish. The proper channels, tried twice, had produced the same result. But movements built on pure faith do not collapse on contact with institutional rejection. They are, if anything, energized by it. Every prophet in every tradition that has ever generated a mass following has a version of this moment. The confrontation with established power that ends in rejection, which is then reframed as confirmation. The powerful rejected Christ. The powerful rejected Moses. The powerful rejected every genuine prophet in history. Therefore, being rejected by the powerful is evidence of authenticity, not evidence of error. Stephen turned south. He was going to Marseille. He was going to the sea, and the sea was going to part for him. The march south from Paris to Marseille is approximately 775 kilometres by modern roads. In the summer of 1212, on the roads available to a mass of poorly equipped, predominantly barefoot peasants and children, it was an ordeal of a different order entirely. The sources do not give us a detailed day-by-day account of the march. What they give us are impressions and outcomes, and from these we can reconstruct something of what it must have been like. It was summer, and the sun in southern France in summer is serious. The column of people, still enormous, though it had certainly shed some members during the weeks since Venmi, as the journey's hardships became apparent, moved through the heat of the Rhénée Valley toward the coast. Water was a constant concern. Food was whatever could be begged from villages along the route, supplemented by whatever could be foraged from the roadside. The sick and the weak fell behind. Some turned back. The chronicles note deaths along the route, though they do not give numbers. What the chronicles do emphasize is the persistence of faith, the singing, the collective prayer, the sense that they were on a pilgrimage as much as a military expedition, that the journey itself had spiritual value independent of what waited at the end. This is an important distinction. A crusade in the traditional sense was organized around military objective. Stephen's movement had taken on the character of a penitential pilgrimage, a mass act of faith whose meaning was located as much in the suffering and the endurance as in any particular destination. This reframing, conscious or unconscious, was psychologically important. It meant that the hardships of the march did not undermine the movement's meaning. They confirmed it. The more difficult the journey, the greater the spiritual merit. The more they suffered, the purer their offering to God. And so they walked on. Through the hills of Burgundy, down the Ray Valley, into the hot, dry, lavender-scented landscape of Provence, toward the blue glitter of the Mediterranean that most of them had never seen and could barely imagine. Marseille in 1212 was one of the most important port cities in the western Mediterranean. It had been a major trading hub since antiquity. The Greeks had founded it as Massalia around 600 BC, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in France. By the 13th century it was a busy, cosmopolitan, commercially sophisticated city with an active harbour, substantial merchant population, and long experience of the crusading trade. Ships and supplies and men had been moving through Marseille toward the Holy Land for over a century. The arrival of Stephen and his enormous, ragged, faith-burning crowd must have been one of the stranger events the city had witnessed. The local population's reaction, as best the sources allow us to reconstruct it, was mixed. There was apparently some genuine sympathy, some provision of food and shelter by charitable citizens and by church institutions in the city. There was also considerable alarm and practical concern about the sudden influx of thousands of hungry, poorly equipped travellers with no clear plan beyond standing at the water's edge and waiting for a miracle. And so they stood at the water's edge and waited for a miracle. Stephen had promised them the sea would part. This was the promise that had moved thousands of people hundreds of miles in summer heat. This was the specific, concrete, verifiable miracle that would prove everything: God's approval, Stephen's calling, the movement's divine mandate. The sea did not part. This moment deserves to be held quietly for a little while. Try to imagine what it felt like to be there. You are 12 years old, or 15, or 20. You have walked for weeks. Your feet are ruined. You have eaten badly and slept on the ground and watched people you started the journey with turn back or fall sick or simply disappear in the night. You have kept going because you believed, genuinely, completely, with everything in you, that God was going to do something impossible. You are standing at the edge of the sea. It is blue and vast and indifferent. The horizon is just water. The waves are coming in exactly as they always come in, as they have always come in, as they will always come in, and nothing happens. The sources do not dwell on this moment in the emotional detail it deserves. Medieval chronicles are not written in the mode of psychological realism. They record events and outcomes, not the interior experience of people who were not important enough to have interior experiences worth recording. But the moment was real. The crowd stood there and the sea did not part, and something in the architecture of the movement shifted. Some people left immediately. The promised miracle had not materialized, which in the theological framework of the time could mean several things. It could mean the timing was not right. It could mean the group's faith was not yet pure enough, contaminated by the unworthy members who had attached themselves to the movement along the way. It could mean Stephen had been wrong, or deceived, or self-deceived. Different people drew different conclusions and acted accordingly. But not everyone left. A significant number stayed. And it is here, in what happened to those who stayed, that the story takes the turn that gives it its darkest chapter. After the sea failed to part, the question that faced the remnant of Stephen's movement was practical and immediate. They were in Marseille. They could not walk to Jerusalem. They could not afford to pay for passage on a merchant ship. They had no resources and no plan beyond the miracle that had not come. And then, the chronicles tell us, they found merchants who offered to help. 2 men are named in the primary sources, I and Hugh, called Hugo Ferreus in Latin, and William the Pig, called Porcus in the sources, which is a name so specific and unflattering that it has the ring of authentic historical memory rather than later embellishment. These two merchants offered to transport Stephen's followers to the Holy Land free of charge, no payment required. 7 ships. God's work. The surviving members of the French movement, those who had not already turned back for home, accepted. They boarded the ships, and we will follow them in a later chapter, because where those ships went and what happened to the people on them is the part of this story that history remembered longest and most painfully. It is the part that, centuries later, may have crystallized into one of the most enduring folk legends in European history. For now, let us leave them on the docks of Marseille. The sun on the water, the smell of salt and timber and rope, the faces of young people looking out at the sea that had refused to open for them, climbing instead into the wooden hold of a merchant ship whose captain had asked for nothing. They did not know yet what that meant. They were about to find out. But before we follow them onto those ships, there is a parallel story happening. One we have not yet touched. While Stephen of Cloyes was preaching in the Loire Valley and gathering his enormous crowd and marching to Paris and then south to the sea, something else was beginning in Germany. Another movement, simultaneously, independently, under the leadership of another young man who also believed God had called him to lead the poor toward Jerusalem. His name was Nicholas of Cologne, and his path would not lead to the sea, it would lead over the mountains. While Stephen's crowd was gathering in the fields outside Vendôme, while the roads of the Loire Valley were filling with the footsteps of peasant children and wandering poor moving toward a boy preacher's promise, something was stirring in the Rhineland that nobody in France knew anything about. It began, as Stephen's movement had begun, with a single young person, a single voice, a single claim of divine calling that somehow, in the specific combustible atmosphere of 1212, caught fire in a way that 1,000 similar claims in 1,000 similar years had not. His name was Nicholas. He came from Cologne, or from the area around it. The sources are not precise about his origins in the way they are imprecise about almost everything concerning him. What they tell us is that he was young, that he was not a shepherd but possibly the son of a merchant or minor craftsman, which would make him marginally higher on the social scale than Stephen, though still far beneath any meaningful definition of privilege, and that he had, like Stephen, a gift. But Nicholas's gift was different from Stephen's in a way that matters. Stephen's gift was heat, emotional, urgent, weeping, fervent heat, the kind of preaching that made crowds press forward to touch the speaker, that generated miracle reports and mass religious experiences, that communicated itself through the body as much as through the words. Nicholas, as best we can reconstruct him from the sources, was something slightly different. He was a visionary in the more organised sense, a boy with a plan, with a symbol, with a theatrical instinct for the gesture that crystallised a movement's identity. He carried a cross shaped like the letter T, known as a Tau cross, which had ancient associations with divine protection and spiritual authority. He held it up when he preached. His followers adopted it. It became the emblem of the German movement in a way that Stephen's movement never quite developed a comparable visual identity. He also had from the beginning a clearer geographical objective than Stephen. Nicholas was not vague about the destination. He was going to Jerusalem. The route was through Italy, south through Germany, over the Alps, down the Italian peninsula to one of the port cities, and then by sea to the Holy Land. This was a real route. Crusading armies had used it before. It was not a fantasy geography invented by an illiterate boy. Someone in Nicholas's background, or someone advising him, had actual geographical knowledge and built it into the movement's founding logic. This detail, the real route, the Tau cross, the organised symbolism, has led some historians to suggest that Nicholas was not operating entirely independently, that there may have been adult figures behind him, or at least alongside him, who provided structure and direction that a teenage boy from the Rhineland would not have generated entirely on his own. The sources do not confirm this, but they do not rule it out, and the contrast with Stephen's more emotionally driven, less practically organised movement is striking enough to invite the question. Whatever his origins and whatever his backing, Nicholas began preaching in the Rhineland in the early summer of 1212, and people came. The Rhineland was, in many ways, even more fertile ground for a popular religious movement than the Loire Valley. The Rhine River and the cities along it, Cologne, Mainz, Worms, Speyer, were among the most economically active regions of the Holy Roman Empire. They were trading centres, pilgrimage destinations, sites of significant Jewish communities that had been brutally massacred during earlier Crusades. They were also, by 1212, marked by a particular kind of social tension that the economic activity generated rather than resolved. Because prosperity in a medieval trading city did not mean equality. It meant that wealth was more visible, more concentrated, and more obviously distributed along lines of birth and connection than in purely agricultural communities. The gap between the merchant families who owned the houses along the Rhine and the labourers and servants and wandering poor who moved through the same streets was not abstract. It was architectural. It was daily. It was the difference between a stone house with glass windows and a sleeping space under someone else's stairs. The poor of the Rhineland cities were in some ways more politically aware than their rural French counterparts. Urban poverty generates a different kind of consciousness than rural poverty. It is surrounded by the evidence of what it lacks in a way that isolated village poverty is not. And the particular religious temperature of the Rhineland in this period was high. The cities of the Rhine had been at the centre of German religious life for centuries. There were old, powerful archbishoprics. There were established monastic communities. There were also, circulating through the same streets, the unauthorized preachers and wandering mystics and popular religious movements that the official church viewed with perpetual suspicion. Nicholas stepped into this environment, and it received him. The crowds that gathered to hear him were, like Stephen's crowds, mixed, not purely children, not purely young people, but weighted toward the young and the poor and the marginal in ways that struck observers. The chronicles that describe his early preaching use language similar to those describing Stephen. The crowds were large. The emotional response was intense. People abandoned their ordinary lives to follow him with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this invitation. By midsummer, Nicholas had gathered a movement substantial enough to begin moving. He fixed his departure point, set his route, and began the march south. Toward the Alps, it is worth pausing here to look at a map, because the geography of what Nicholas was proposing is important and is often glossed over in popular accounts of the Children's Crusade. The Alps are not a moderate obstacle. They are one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe, a continuous wall of high mountain terrain running roughly east to west across the northern edge of the Italian peninsula, with passes that even in summer are high, cold, exhausting, and in some conditions genuinely lethal. In 1212, without modern roads, without weather forecasting, without the kind of equipment that even a modest modern hiking party would consider basic, crossing the Alps was a serious undertaking for a well-equipped, well-provisioned adult traveller. For a column of thousands of predominantly young, poorly equipped, inadequately fed people in the summer heat, it was something else entirely. The route Nicholas chose appears to have taken his column through the Rhineland south toward the Swiss plateau, then through one of the major Alpine passes, most likely the Great St. Bernard Pass or possibly the Spliegen Pass, though the sources are not specific enough to be certain, and down into the Po Valley of northern Italy. The Great St. Bernard Pass sits at an elevation of approximately 2,469 metres above sea level. Even in the height of summer, temperatures at that altitude can drop sharply at night. The terrain is rocky, the paths narrow, the descent on the Italian side steep and technically demanding. There is a hospice at the summit that monks had maintained since the 11th century specifically to assist travellers and pilgrims in difficulty, and the fact of its existence tells you something about how regularly people in difficulty were encountered at that altitude. Nicholas's column hit the Alps in what was probably late July or August of 1212 at the height of summer, which was the best possible timing and still brutally inadequate for what they were attempting. The crossing of the Alps is the part of Nicholas's story where the sources, for once, speak with unusual consistency, not because they agree on numbers or specific incidents, they don't, but because the emotional register of their descriptions aligns in a way that suggests they are all drawing on a common, accurate understanding of what happened. It was catastrophic, not in a single dramatic event, not in an avalanche or a storm that swept people off a mountainside, though the chronicles do mention some deaths by exposure and accident. The catastrophe was slower and more relentless than that. It was attrition. The steady, grinding, day-by-day reduction of a column of human beings who had not brought enough food, had not brought enough warm clothing, had not rested adequately before the climb, and had not fully understood what they were walking into. The ascent began in heat. The lower slopes in summer are warm, the vegetation dense, the streams full of snowmelt. For the first day or two, it probably felt manageable. The excitement of finally moving, finally heading south, the voices lifted in hymns and prayer echoing off the rock faces, the cross held high against the blue sky, all of this sustained the column through the initial stages. Then the altitude began its work. For people who had grown up at sea level in the flat river plains of the Rhine Valley, the physiological effects of altitude were likely confusing and frightening. Headaches that came on without warning, shortness of breath that made the simplest effort feel enormous. Nausea, dizziness, the sense that the body was failing at something it should be able to do easily. These are the symptoms of altitude sickness, and in 1212 nobody knew what altitude sickness was, let alone how to treat it. The sufferers would have interpreted their symptoms through the only framework available to them: spiritual meaning, divine testing, the body's protest against the demands being made of it by faith. The nights got cold, very cold. People who had left the Rhine Valley in summer clothing, in the clothes of people who lived at an altitude of perhaps 50 metres above sea level, were sleeping on rock at 2,000 metres in temperatures that could approach freezing even in August. The chronicles mention deaths by cold with a matter-of-factness that speaks to how common such deaths became. Not a notable catastrophe, just the ongoing expected cost of continuing. The physically weakest fell behind. Then they stopped. Some were left on the mountain because there was no way to carry them, and no reason to stop for them if stopping meant dying alongside them. Some made it to the hospice at the summit, where the monks provided what help they could, which was warmth and food and the last rites for those who needed them. Many turned back. This is the number that the sources cannot give us, and that we most need. How many of the people who began the Alpine crossing with Nicholas actually made it to the other side? The chronicles suggest substantial losses, both to death and to desertion, without quantifying them. The column that descended into the Italian side of the Alps was meaningfully smaller than the one that had begun the ascent. But it was still a column. Nicholas was still at its head, the cross was still held high, and below them, spread out in the summer haze of the Po Valley, was Italy. The descent into Italy must have felt like resurrection. After the cold and the altitude and the dying on the mountain, the Italian side of the Alps comes down quickly into warmth. The Po Valley in late summer is lush and flat and green, with the particular golden green quality of Italian agricultural land that has been worked and tended for thousands of years. The air smells of warm earth and water and the particular sweetness of cultivated vegetation. After weeks on bare rock, it must have been almost unbearably beautiful. The surviving members of Nicholas's column came down off the mountain and kept moving south, through the cities of the Po Valley, Pavia perhaps, or along the route toward Genoa on the Ligurian coast. The chronicles are not precise about the exact path, but they are clear about the general direction and about the sequence of cities that became important to the movement's Italian phase. The first major city they reached, or at least the first city that the sources identify as significant to their story, was Genoa. Genoa in 1212 was one of the great maritime powers of the Mediterranean. Its merchant fleet ranged from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Its bankers financed kings and crusades. Its sailors knew every port between Britain and Egypt. It was wealthy, sophisticated, internationally connected, and deeply experienced in the business of moving large numbers of people by sea. Crusading armies had been passing through Genoa for over a century. The arrival of Nicholas and his column, ragged, reduced by the Alpine crossing, but still numerous and still burning with their stated purpose, was apparently a significant enough event to attract formal attention from the city's authorities. What the Genoese offered, according to the sources, was not ships. It was citizenship. Or rather, the sources describe an offer extended to any member of the group who wished to settle in Genoa. The city was apparently willing to absorb a portion of the column's members as residents, presumably seeing in the influx of young, able-bodied people a potential economic asset. Some accepted. The sources suggest a meaningful number of Nicholas's followers chose Genoa's offer over the continuation of the march, which tells you something about the state of the column by the time it reached the city, tired enough, reduced enough, that the prospect of stopping and being absorbed into a functioning city was more attractive than continuing toward a destination that seemed to be receding, with every step. Nicholas himself did not stay. He pushed south with whoever remained. The movement's next significant stop, the sources suggest, was Pisa. Pisa was, like Genoa, a major maritime city, one of the Italian city-states that had built its power and wealth on Mediterranean trade, and whose ships were regular features of every major port from Marseille to Alexandria. The Pisans and the Genoese were fierce commercial rivals, but both had the same fundamental asset, ships. In Pisa, something happened that the sources describe briefly, and that has generated significant historical discussion. 2 ships were apparently provided to some members of the group for passage to the Holy Land. The chronicles do not agree on the details: who provided the ships, how many people boarded them, what terms were agreed to, what happened to the ships afterward. Some sources say the passengers reached the Holy Land and were there absorbed into the existing Crusader communities. Some say the ships were lost. The ambiguity here is genuinely frustrating, because if some of Nicholas's followers actually made it to the Holy Land by ship from Pisa, it represents one of the only concrete outcomes of the entire Children's Crusade that could be called a success by the movement's own stated goals. But the majority of Nicholas's remaining followers did not take those ships, if they existed. The majority continued south on foot, toward Rome, the decision to go to Rome. If it was a decision and not simply the natural direction of travel for a column moving south down the Italian peninsula, was either very shrewd or instinctively correct, or both. Because Rome was the centre of the church. Rome was where the Pope lived. And the Pope in 1212 was Innocent III, the same Innocent III who had called the Albigensian Crusade, who was in the process of organising the Fifth Crusade, who was arguably the most powerful individual in the Western world. If anyone had the authority to give Nicholas's movement official sanction, to turn the raggle-taggle remnant of a Rhine Valley popular uprising into a recognised, supported, legitimate crusade, it was Innocent. Nicholas arrived in Rome with what remained of his column. The sources do not agree on the numbers, but they agree on the impression, a substantially reduced group, marked by the Alpine crossing and the long Italian march, but still identifiable as a movement with a purpose and a leader. Innocent III received them. This in itself is remarkable. The Pope was not in the habit of granting audiences to wandering groups of poor young people from Germany. That he received Nicholas at all suggests either that the movement had attracted enough attention to make ignoring it politically inadvisable, or that Innocent was curious, or that someone in his entourage judged the encounter worth having. Whatever the reason, they met. And what Innocent said, or what the sources report him as saying, which is the closest we can get, is one of the most interesting responses in the entire story. He did not condemn them. He did not mock them as the University of Paris had mocked Stephen's movement. He praised their zeal. He expressed genuine admiration for their devotion and their willingness to suffer in the service of God. And then he told them to go home. The specific shape of Innocent's response is worth examining, because it is careful in a way that a less politically sophisticated man would not have managed. He could not simply endorse them. An unauthorized popular crusade, led by a German teenager with no military capacity, no financing, and no political backing, was not a crusade the papacy could officially support without undermining the serious, organised, properly constituted Fifth Crusade that Innocent was simultaneously trying to put together. Endorsing Nicholas would have been theologically and politically incoherent. But he also could not condemn them without condemning the zeal and the faith that had moved them, which was the same zeal and faith that the crusading movement depended on for its popular support. You could not tell 10,000 people that their willingness to walk over the Alps in service of God was foolish, without simultaneously telling every donor and every potential recruit to every future crusade that popular religious enthusiasm was not a virtue but a problem. So, Innocent threaded the needle. He honoured the impulse, released them from their vow on grounds of youth and incapacity, and sent them away with his blessing rather than his support. It was a masterpiece of institutional management. It was also, for the people who had walked from Cologne over the Alps to Rome on the strength of their faith, a gentle, polite, and devastating rejection. Nicholas accepted it. He had no choice. The Pope had spoken, and in the framework within which Nicholas and his followers operated, the Pope's word was very close to God's word. The movement could not continue in defiance of papal dismissal without becoming something other than a movement of Catholic faith, which was the only thing it had ever claimed to be. The column turned around. They began the long walk north. The return journey is the part of Nicholas's story that the sources handle most briefly, and that imagination fills most painfully. Going south, even over the Alps, there had been purpose. There had been the pull of Jerusalem ahead, the certainty of divine approval, the momentum of a growing movement. The singing had been real, the faith had been real. The specific quality of religious excitement that makes physical hardship not just bearable but meaningful had been available to everyone in the column as a resource, a fuel, something to burn when the body flagged. Going north, there was none of that. There was just the road, and the mountains waiting at the end of it. The chronicles note that the return crossing of the Alps killed more people than the southward crossing had. This is both plausible and logical. The column was smaller, weaker, more depleted of both physical and psychological resources. The summer was fading, the nights were getting longer and colder, and the specific sustaining energy of belief in imminent divine intervention was gone, replaced by nothing except the practical necessity of getting home. Some did not make it. Some died on the mountain for the second time in a single summer. Some made it over and then died on the plain roads of the return journey, from illness or exhaustion or the simple failure of bodies that had been pushed too far too long. Some reached the Rhine Valley, some made it home to Cologne. How many? The sources cannot tell us. The chronicles mention the return briefly, record the deaths vaguely, note that Nicholas made it back, or that some sources say he did, and then the movement effectively dissolves from the historical record. There is one final note about Nicholas that the sources include, and it lands with a particular quiet weight. His father, the sources name him without further detail, was apparently held partly responsible for the disaster. The reasoning, as best we can reconstruct it, was that he had encouraged his son's preaching, possibly facilitated the gathering of followers, and therefore bore some moral responsibility for the deaths that followed. The chronicle that records this reports that Nicholas's father was hanged. If this is true, and it may not be, the source is single and late. It is a detail of almost unbearable specificity. The father who perhaps stood at the beginning of his son's mission with pride, watching the crowds gather, watching the cross held high, watching thousands of people respond to his boy's voice, and then standing later, after the Alps and the Italian roads and Rome's gentle dismissal and the terrible return, under whatever judgment his community and his Lord applied to the question of who was responsible for all those deaths. History does not record what Nicholas himself thought about any of it, whether he considered himself a failure, whether he went back to whatever ordinary life was available to a young man from Cologne who had led thousands of people over the Alps and back for nothing, whether he ever spoke about it again. He disappears from the sources entirely after the return. No later record, no adult life documented, no account of what became of him. He was perhaps 14 when he began. He was perhaps 15 or 16 by the time it was over. He walked over the Alps twice in a single summer, watched people die on the mountain both times, was gently dismissed by the most powerful man in the Western world, and then walked home. And then he was gone. It is worth stepping back at this point and holding both movements together in the mind simultaneously. Stephen in France, Nicholas in Germany, both young, both claiming divine calling, both drawing enormous crowds from the same social depths, the poor, the young, the marginal, the people with nothing to lose and everything to believe, both rejected by official power, both ending in failure by every practical measure. And yet between them they moved what contemporary chronicles suggest were tens of thousands of people. They emptied villages. They pulled children off farms and young men out of workshops and women away from the domestic routines that the medieval world considered their natural and proper sphere. They generated a wave of popular religious energy so intense that it alarmed kings and popes and university masters simultaneously. Why? This is the question that sits underneath everything else. Not just why did Stephen and Nicholas believe what they believed, the world they lived in makes that comprehensible, as we explored in the first chapter. But why did so many people follow them? Why did the specific promise of a pauper's crusade, a children's crusade, find such immediate and enormous resonance in this particular year? Part of the answer is the accumulated frustration of a crusading culture that had been failing for decades. Part of it is the specific poverty and desperation of the peasant class in a period of unusual economic pressure. Part of it is the charisma of the leaders themselves, whatever form that charisma took. But part of it, and this is the part that historians are most reluctant to say, plainly because it resists the kind of clean causal analysis that professional history prefers, is something about 1212 specifically, something in the air of that particular year that made the impossible feel imminent in a way it had not felt in the years before and would not feel in the years after. A collective mood, a shared sense that things could not continue as they were, that something had to give, that God was surely about to act. These moods are real historical forces. They are impossible to measure and difficult to document, and absolutely crucial to understanding why some moments generate mass movements and why identical conditions in other moments generate nothing at all. 1212 was one of those moments. And Stephen and Nicholas, whoever they really were and whatever they really believed, were the people who happened to be standing in the right field at the right time with the right voice. The German movement is over. Nicholas has gone home, if home still existed for him. The Alps are behind us. But the French story is not finished. We left Stephen's followers on the docks of Marseille, climbing into the ships of two merchants who had asked for nothing in return. That nothing, it turns out, was not nothing at all. What it was, and where those ships went, and what happened to the young people inside them, that is where we are going next. And it is the part of the story that even 800 years of distance does not make easy to tell. We left them on the docks of Marseille. Let us go back there now. Let us stand on those docks for a moment before we board the ships. Because the moment of boarding is one of those historical pivot points where everything that came before it and everything that came after it hinge on a single decision made by people who did not know it was a decision that would define them forever. The crowd that had made it to Marseille was not the crowd that had left Venmaye. Weeks of marching through the summer heat of southern France had done their work. People had turned back. People had fallen sick and been left in the care of whatever roadside charity was available. People had simply disappeared in the night. The specific combination of exhaustion and doubt reaching a threshold that faith could no longer hold back. The enormous, singing, weeping, miracle-expecting mass that had gathered in the fields outside Venmaye had been reduced by the road to something smaller and more ragged and more desperate. But still substantial, still believing, still standing at the edge of the Mediterranean, looking at the water that had not parted, waiting for whatever God intended to do next. And then Hugh the Iron and William the Pig walked onto the docks and made their offer. These two men deserve more attention than history has given them, because they are among the most consequential minor figures in the entire story and also among the most opaque. Hugh the Iron, Hugo Furius in the Latin sources, and William the Pig, Wilmus Porcus, are named by the primary chronicle that deals most directly with the fate of the French movement, the Chronica Regia Coloniensis, and by several later medieval sources that drew on earlier accounts. The nicknames, as noted before, have the quality of authentic historical memory rather than literary invention. Nobody constructing a villain for a morality tale would name him William the Pig. It is too mundane, too specific, too unimaginatively unflattering to be a deliberate literary choice. It is the kind of name that sticks to a person in a community that knows him, the kind of name earned rather than assigned. What we know about them is limited but telling. They were merchants operating out of Marseille or associated with its port trade. They were men of sufficient resources to own or charter multiple ships, the sources say 7, which places them in the upper tier of the commercial class, without necessarily making them wealthy in the way that the great trading families of Genoa or Venice were wealthy. They were experienced enough in the realities of Mediterranean commerce to know exactly what they were doing. The offer they made was, on its surface, an act of extraordinary charity. 7 ships. Free passage, no payment required. God's work, they said. We are moved by your faith. Let us help you on your way to Jerusalem. The crowd accepted. Of course they accepted. They were standing on a dock with no money, no ships, no means of getting anywhere, their miracle having failed to materialize in the specific form they had expected. And here were 2 men with ships, asking for nothing, invoking God's purpose. In the theological framework that governed every decision these young people made, the arrival of Hugh and William at exactly this moment of need was itself evidence of divine provision. This was how God worked, not by parting seas dramatically, but by sending ships quietly. The miracle had come in a different form than expected. This was the kind of realization that sustains faith through disappointment, and it would have felt like solid ground after the terrible uncertainty of the sea's refusal to open. 7 ships. Some sources give passenger numbers, though these vary widely and all are probably approximate. The total across all 7 vessels was perhaps several thousand people, the remnant of the French movement, those who had stayed after the sea failed to part and who had not yet found their way home. They boarded. The ships left the harbour, the coast of France receded behind them, and Hugh the Iron and William the Pig sailed them toward Africa. The Mediterranean crossing from Marseille toward the Holy Land was not a simple voyage even for experienced sailors. The medieval Mediterranean was a complicated sea, beautiful and deadly, subject to sudden storms, navigable only by people with genuine knowledge of its moods and its geography. The standard route from southern France toward the Crusader ports of the Levant ran roughly southeast, passing south of Sardinia and Sicily, hugging the North African coast for a portion of the journey, then turning northeast toward the Palestinian coast. It was on this route that the first disaster occurred. 2 of the 7 ships were lost. The chronicles describe a storm, a sudden violent squall of the kind the Mediterranean generates with what sailors of every era have described as malicious unpredictability. The 2 ships caught in the worst of it sank. The sources name the location as an island near Sardinia, sometimes identified as the island of San Pietro, sometimes called the island of Akon or Akona in medieval nomenclature. The people on those 2 ships drowned. We do not know how many. The sources give numbers ranging from a few hundred to several thousand, which is the kind of variation that tells you the chroniclers were estimating from rumour rather than recording from documentation. What we know is that the ships went down and the people on them died in the water of the Mediterranean, far from home, having believed until the last moment that God was moving them toward Jerusalem. The 5 remaining ships sailed on, and here the sources become both more specific and more damning. The 5 ships did not turn northeast toward the Palestinian coast. They turned south and west, toward the North African coast, toward the ports of the Maghreb, the Islamic world's western Mediterranean littoral, stretching from what is now Tunisia through Algeria to Morocco. Specifically, the chronicles say, toward the port of Bougie, on the coast of what is now Algeria, and toward the port city of Ceuta. In these ports, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig delivered their cargo, not to Crusader kingdoms, not to the shores of the Holy Land, to slave markets. Let that land for a moment before we continue, because it is the kind of historical fact that the mind wants to move past quickly, to process and file and leave behind, and it deserves instead to be held still and looked at directly. These were children, young people, adolescents and young adults who had walked hundreds of miles through summer heat on the strength of their faith, who had stood at the edge of the sea and waited for a miracle, who had boarded ships provided by strangers because those ships seemed like God's answer to their need, and those strangers had sold them. The slave trade in the medieval Mediterranean was not a marginal or unusual phenomenon. It was a fully institutionalized, widely practiced, economically significant feature of the world on both its Christian and Islamic sides. Slaves were traded in the major ports of North Africa, the Levant, the Iberian Peninsula, and Sicily. They came from many sources: war captives, kidnapping raids, the purchase of people from desperate families, the judicial enslavement of criminals. They served in households, in agricultural estates, in administrative roles, in military units. The Islamic world had a long tradition of the slave soldier, the Mamluk, who might rise to significant power and influence. The Christian world used slaves in more purely domestic and agricultural capacities, but used them nonetheless. The specific market that Hugh and William were supplying was likely a well-established commercial relationship. This was not an improvised crime of opportunity. The logistics of chartering 7 ships, travelling to Marseille, making the offer to Stephen's followers, organising the loading and the passage, and delivering the human cargo to specific buyers in specific North African ports required planning, required contacts, required prior knowledge of a market willing to pay for young European captives. Some historians have suggested that Hugh and William were operating in connection with the Almohad Caliphate, the Islamic empire then governing North Africa and most of the Iberian Peninsula, which had significant interest in European slaves and the commercial connections to pay well for them. Others have suggested connections to the slave markets of Alexandria or further east. The sources are not specific enough to confirm either theory, but the professional quality of the operation points clearly toward an established commercial network rather than an improvised crime. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig were not opportunists who spotted a vulnerable crowd and improvised a scheme. They were operators in a pre-existing trade who travelled north to Marseille specifically to recruit. The fate of the young people sold into slavery in North Africa is almost entirely undocumented. This is one of the most painful aspects of the story, and one of the most historically significant. The people who survived the crossing and were sold into the markets of Bougie and Ceuta disappear from the written record almost entirely, because the written record of medieval Europe was maintained by people who were not interested in the subsequent lives of French peasant children sold to North African buyers. They were not important enough to track. They did not return to create their own accounts. They had no advocates in the literate world who might have pursued their stories. What we have are fragments. A single chronicle, the one that forms the most detailed source for the entire French movement, reports that some of the enslaved young people were sold to the governor of Africa, and that among them were scholars and ecclesiastics who were prized by their buyers for their learning and their potential usefulness as translators, administrators, or teachers. This detail, if accurate, suggests that the slave market that received them was sophisticated enough to sort and value the cargo by capacity, rather than simply by physical strength, which in turn suggests a market oriented toward domestic and administrative slavery, rather than purely agricultural labour. Another fragment, even more tantalizing and even less verifiable, reports that some of the enslaved young people eventually converted to Islam. This would not be surprising. Conversion opened doors in the Islamic world that were closed to slaves who maintained their Christian identity, and the pressure toward conversion in a slave context was not always or even primarily violent. It could be social, economic, relational. The gradual drift of a person embedded in a new culture who had lost all practical connection to the old one, and some, a small number, the sources hint at without documenting clearly, may eventually have been ransomed. The medieval Mediterranean had a functioning ransom economy. The same commercial networks that moved slaves also moved ransom payments, and wealthy families or church institutions sometimes paid to recover enslaved people of sufficient importance or with sufficient advocates. But the children of French peasants had no wealthy families and no institutional advocates. The likelihood of ransom for most of them was essentially zero. They were gone, absorbed into the enormous, anonymous, undocumented mass of the enslaved who moved through the medieval world without leaving traces in the records that history depends on. Now, the historical record is clear about the broad outlines of what happened, but the moment has come to do something that responsible history requires in this case, which is to examine what we actually know versus what we think we know. Because the Children's Crusade is one of the most narratively compelling events in medieval history, and narrative compellingness has a long track record of distorting historical memory. The primary sources for the Children's Crusade are limited in number and deeply problematic in nature. The most detailed accounts were written years or decades after the events they describe, by chroniclers who were not eyewitnesses, working from oral tradition and earlier written fragments that are themselves lost. The numbers in these sources, the 30,000 at Vendmy, the 7 ships, the specific ports of North African delivery, cannot be verified against independent contemporary documentation. This does not mean the Children's Crusade did not happen. The broad outlines, a popular religious movement in France in 1212, centred on a young preacher, drawing large crowds of poor people and young people, marching toward the sea with crusading intentions, are attested by enough independent sources with enough consistency to be taken as historical reality. The German movement under Nicholas is similarly attested. These things happened. But the specific details, particularly the details about the slave ships, appear primarily in a small number of sources, the most important of which is a chronicle written roughly 18 years after the events it describes, by a German monk named Alberic of Troyfontaines, who was almost certainly working from oral reports rather than documentary evidence. Some historians accept Alberic's account essentially at face value, noting that 18 years is not a great distance, and that the slave trade details he describes are consistent with what we know about Mediterranean commerce in this period. Others are more sceptical, arguing that the slave ship story has the quality of a moral fable, the innocent believers betrayed by wicked merchants, that medieval chroniclers were culturally predisposed to generate about the failure of popular religious movements, as a way of explaining the failure without attributing it to God's displeasure or the movement's own theological errors. Both positions have merit. The truth is probably that something like what Alberic describes happened, that some portion of the French movement ended in slavery, through the operation of a pre-existing commercial network, while acknowledging that the specific details, the numbers, the names of the ports, the total of 7 ships, may carry the inflation and the narrative tidiness that oral tradition imposes on messy historical events over time. What we can say with confidence is this: the French movement ended badly. The people who boarded those ships did not reach Jerusalem. Many of them did not come home. Some of them died at sea. And whatever happened to the rest of them, it was not what they had walked all that way to find. There is one more thread to pull on in this chapter, and it is the thread that leads away from the medieval Mediterranean entirely and into the forests of northern Germany. It is the thread that connects the Children's Crusade, or something adjacent to it, something growing from the same soil, to one of the most enduring and most analysed folk legends in European history. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. The legend, in its most familiar form, goes like this. The town of Hamelin in Lower Saxony was plagued by rats. A mysterious piper appeared and offered to rid the town of the rats in exchange for payment. The town agreed. The piper played his pipe, and the rats followed the music out of town and drowned in the Weser River. The town refused to pay. The piper returned, played again, and this time it was the children of Hamelin who followed him. 130 children, the legend specifies, out of town, into a mountain or a cave or a distant land. And they were never seen again. The legend has been analysed from every conceivable angle by folklorists and historians for centuries. What interests us here is a specific scholarly theory, first developed seriously in the 19th century and still actively debated. That connects the Pied Piper directly to the Children's Crusade or to the broader phenomenon of child migration and child loss that the Crusade represents. The connection is not as simple as the Pied Piper story as a retelling of the Children's Crusade. It is more subtle and more interesting than that. The earliest documentary references to the Hamelin legend, actual contemporary or near-contemporary evidence, as opposed to the later elaborated literary versions, do not mention rats at all. The rats are a later addition, probably developed sometime in the 14th or 15th century, and appear to have been grafted onto an earlier, simpler story. The earlier story, as attested in a stained glass window in the Church of Market Church in Hamelin that was destroyed in 1660, but is described in records, and in a reference in the town chronicles of Hamelin itself from the late 13th century, is simply this. On the day of Saints John and Paul, the 26th of June, a piper led 130 children out of Hamelin, and they were lost. No rats, no plague, just a piper, and children who followed him and did not come back. The specific date, June 26, is recorded with unusual precision for a medieval folk memory. The specific number, 130, is similarly precise. These details suggest a real event being commemorated rather than a symbolic story being told. Towns did not build commemorative stained glass windows about metaphors. So what happened in Hamelin, and what does it have to do with the Children's Crusade? The most compelling scholarly theory, associated primarily with the German historian Jürgen Udolph, and developed by several other researchers, does not connect Hamelin directly to the 1212 Crusade, but rather to a broader pattern of medieval population movement that the Crusade exemplifies. The theory runs roughly as follows. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the eastern regions of what is now Germany and Poland were being systematically colonized by settlers from the more densely populated Western German territories. This colonization, known in German historiography as Ostsiedlung, the eastern settlement, was a massive, sustained, organized population movement that reshaped the demographics of Central Europe over several generations. Landowners and rulers in the east actively recruited settlers from the west, offering land and favourable terms to families willing to relocate. The recruitment was done by agents called locators, literally locators, who travelled through western German towns and villages, offering terms and leading groups of settlers east. The locator was a real figure, a professional recruiter who moved people for economic reasons, and his activities sometimes involved young people, sometimes involved taking people away from their home communities permanently, and sometimes generated grief and confusion among the families left behind when the recruited settlers departed and did not return. Under this theory, the Pied Piper story is a folk memory, distorted by time and embellishment into a supernatural tale, of a locator who recruited a group of young people from Hamelin for the Eastern settlement led them away, and was remembered by the community they left behind as a mysterious figure whose music stole their children. The rat plague element, added later, may have been a response to the Black Death of the mid-14th century, which was associated in popular imagination with rats, and which generated a powerful cultural overlay on earlier stories. The connection to the Children's Crusade is not that the Pied Piper story is directly about 1212. It is that both phenomena, the Crusade and the Eastern settlement recruitment, belong to the same broader pattern of young people being led away from their home communities by compelling figures with promises, and not coming back. The Children's Crusade is the most dramatic and documented example of this pattern. But it was not unique. It was an expression of something endemic to early 13th century Europe, the mobility of the poor, the vulnerability of the young, the readiness of large numbers of people without property or prospects to follow anyone who offered a compelling destination. The locators exploited this. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig exploited it. The Children's Crusade generated and then failed to protect the people it had mobilized. The Pied Piper story, in whatever historical reality underlies it, belongs to this same world. The figure leading children away with music is the same figure as the merchant offering free ships, is the same figure as the locator promising land in the east, is the same figure as the boy preacher promising a sea that would part. They are all, in their different ways, people who offered a journey to somewhere better and delivered something else entirely. This is why the Pied Piper story has survived for 800 years with its emotional power essentially intact. It is not a story about rats. It was never really a story about rats. It is a story about the vulnerability of children to the compelling promise, and about the grief of communities that lose their young to something they cannot follow or fight or understand. It resonates because the thing it describes did not stop happening in 1212, or in 1284, or in any century since. Back to Marseille. Back to the docks, back to the 5 remaining ships making their way south and west toward North Africa. There is one more piece of this story that the sources provide, and it concerns what happened in the slave markets themselves, not to the enslaved young people, whose fate, as we have established, is largely undocumented, but to the dynamic that the chronicles describe playing out between the buyers and the specific subset of captives who resisted conversion. The chronicles, and here we are dealing with accounts that are frankly hagiographic in character, meaning they are shaped by the desire to present certain figures as martyrs rather than by a neutral documentary impulse, describe a group of young people who refused to renounce their Christian faith when pressed to do so by their captors. The sources name some of them. They describe their interrogations. They describe their refusals. And in the most dramatic versions of the account, they describe executions, young people put to death for refusing to convert. The historical verifiability of these specific martyrdom accounts is low. They have the structure and the language of the saint's life genre, which was a well-established literary form with its own conventions and its own tendency to generate the details that the genre required regardless of what the historical record actually contained. A story about innocent young Christians captured by Muslim slavers needed martyrs, and the martyrdom accounts read like they were shaped by that need as much as by historical memory. This does not mean no one resisted. This does not mean no one was harmed for their resistance. In the complex reality of the slave markets of medieval North Africa, both things, accommodation and resistance, survival through compliance, and death through defiance, were certainly possible, and probably both happened. What we cannot do is treat the specific martyrdom narratives as reliable documentary evidence. What we can do is recognise that the people on those ships, whatever specifically happened to each of them, were in an impossible situation entirely of Hugh and William's making, and that their outcomes ranged from death at sea to enslavement to possible eventual ransom, with very little in between that could be called anything other than a catastrophe. There is a coda to Hugh and William's story that the sources provide, and that history has largely ignored, possibly because it disrupts the clean moral narrative of innocent victims and wicked perpetrators. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig were eventually caught. The specific mechanism by which their crime became known and prosecuted is not fully documented, but the sources indicate that their operation came to the attention of authorities, whether through survivors, through returning members of the movement who had turned back before boarding, or through the kind of commercial gossip that moves through port cities, and that legal consequences followed. The sources are not specific about what those consequences were. One account suggests execution, others are vaguer. What seems clear is that the two merchants did not simply profit from their crime and retire comfortably. The medieval legal and commercial world, which tolerated a great deal, apparently drew a line somewhere in the vicinity of sailing shiploads of French children to North African slave markets, and that line had consequences. But consequences for Hugh and William, however severe, did not bring anyone home, did not return anyone to the village in France they had left months earlier, walking behind a boy with a letter from Christ, did not give back to any parent the child who had slipped away one summer morning to follow a voice that promised the sea would part. The sea had not parted. The ships had sailed the wrong way. And the children who had believed most completely, who had stayed when others turned back, who had boarded the ships when the more cautious had found other ways home, they were the ones who paid the highest price for their faith. There is something about this specific injustice, the way the depth of belief directly increased the severity of the outcome, that resists easy moral framing. The children who doubted most, who turned back earliest, who never made it to Marseille, survived. The children who believed most completely, who persisted through every discouragement, who stood on the dock and saw the ships as God's provision rather than as a trap, those are the ones who did not come home. This is not the moral structure of a reassuring story. It does not resolve into the comfort of virtue rewarded. It resolves into something much older and much harder, the recognition that faith, however genuine, however pure, however total, does not protect its bearers from the world's capacity for cruelty. That the innocence of the believer is not a shield, that the most terrible outcomes sometimes find the most undeserving people, simply because they were in the wrong place with the wrong kind of trust at the wrong moment in history. The children of the French movement did not fail. They were failed by merchants who saw in their faith a commercial opportunity, by a world that did not protect them, by the gap between what they were promised and what the world actually had to offer them. That gap between promise and delivery, between faith and outcome, between the sea that should have parted and the ships that went the wrong way, is the wound at the centre of this story, and it is a wound that, as we will see in this final chapter, the people who came after these children spent a very long time trying to understand, to explain, and to make mean something. Every story needs someone to survive it. Not because survival is the point, but because without survivors there is no story, only silence. The particular silence of events that happened to people who left no record and no one to speak for them afterward. The children's crusade had survivors. Not enough, and not the ones who deserved most to survive, but enough to carry something back. Enough to sit across from a monk with a quill and say, "This is what happened. This is where we went. This is what we found when we got there." What the survivors carried back was not triumph. It was not even the clean narrative of noble failure that medieval culture was equipped to honour and absorb. It was something messier and more difficult. A story of manipulation and death, and the sea that did not part, and the ships that went the wrong way, wrapped around a core of faith so genuine and so total that even the people telling the story against it, even the chroniclers who wanted to dismiss it as foolishness, could not quite bring themselves to mock the faith itself. Only what the faith had walked into. The immediate aftermath of both movements was confusion. In France, the return of survivors, those who had turned back before Marseille, those who had refused the ships, those who had made their way home overland from the southern coast, was not a triumphant homecoming in any sense. It was a trickle of exhausted, diminished young people arriving back in villages that had watched them leave months earlier full of songs and certainty. The chronicles describe them as returning in poverty and shame, which tells us something about how their communities received them, not with pity, not primarily, with the particular cold judgment that medieval communities reserved for people who had abandoned their duties, their work, their families, their obligations to the household and the Lord, for something that had turned out to be nothing. The shame was real, and it was social as much as personal. These were people from communities where everyone's labour mattered to everyone else's survival, where a young man who spent the summer marching toward Marseille instead of bringing in the harvest had imposed a cost on his household that the household could not necessarily absorb. The spiritual economy that had made the departure meaningful, God would reward the sacrifice. The purity of the Crusaders' intention would reflect well on the family left behind, had been completely voided by the failure of the enterprise. What remained was just the cost, with nothing on the other side of the ledger. The ones who did not come back at all, the ones lost at sea, the ones sold in North Africa, the ones who had died on the road south or on Nicholas's mountain crossing, their absence was not explained to their families for some time, if it was explained at all. The medieval world had no mechanism for the systematic notification of families when a member died far from home. News travelled with travellers, which meant it travelled slowly and incompletely, and often not at all. Some families may have waited years for a child who was already dead, or already enslaved in a city they had never heard of, on a coast they could not have located on any map. This particular grief, the grief of not knowing, of waiting for someone who is not coming, and not being told why, is one of the most psychologically tormenting forms of loss. It has a modern name, ambiguous loss. The medieval world had no name for it, but it had the experience of it in abundance, and the Children's Crusade generated it in concentrated, specific, localized form in hundreds of villages across France and Germany simultaneously. The institutional church's response to the failure of both movements was careful and revealing. Innocent III, who had gently dismissed Nicholas in Rome with praise for his zeal and a recommendation to go home, did not issue any formal condemnation of the Children's Crusade after the fact. This restraint was almost certainly deliberate. A formal condemnation would have required the Church to take a position on what the movements had been. Heretical? Merely misguided? Genuinely inspired, but practically disastrous? And none of these positions was without significant theological and political difficulty. If the movements were heretical, then the enormous popular response to them was evidence of a dangerous level of popular disaffection with the official church, which was not a message Innocent wanted to amplify. If they were merely misguided, then the church had failed to intervene effectively when it had the opportunity. Both Philip of France and Innocent himself had encountered these movements and essentially let them proceed, and a formal post hoc condemnation would highlight the institutional failure of that response. And if they were genuinely inspired, then the disasters that followed them required a theological explanation that the Church was not in a position to provide without significant difficulty. So the Church said relatively little officially. Individual chroniclers and theologians said more, and the range of their responses is itself historically interesting. Some interpreted the failure of the Children's Crusade through the lens of divine punishment, not punishment of the children themselves, whose faith was generally acknowledged as sincere, but punishment of the corrupt adult world that had failed to protect them, or punishment of the Church for its own inadequacies, or simply the mysterious workings of a God whose purposes were not always transparent to human understanding. This interpretation had the advantage of preserving both the children's innocence and God's justice, at the cost of leaving the specific mechanism of divine purpose somewhat opaque. Others took a harder line. The movements had been imprudent and unauthorized, led by people with no theological training and no ecclesiastical mandate, and their failure was the natural and predictable consequence of acting outside the proper channels of church authority. This interpretation was satisfying from an institutional management perspective, but required a certain cold-bloodedness about the children involved that not all chroniclers were willing to maintain. A third group, smaller, less institutionally powerful, but historically interesting, interpreted the Children's Crusade as evidence of a fundamental problem with the crusading enterprise itself. If God was not blessing these movements, perhaps God was not blessing any of the Crusades. Perhaps the entire framework of holy war needed to be reconsidered. This interpretation was radical enough that it appears in the sources only obliquely, in the form of questions rather than conclusions, in the hesitations and qualifications of writers who sensed where their logic was leading and chose not to follow it all the way. The formal chroniclers, the monks and clerics who wrote the Latin accounts that constitute our primary sources, handled the Children's Crusade with a notable mixture of fascination and discomfort. Fascination because the story was inherently compelling. Mass popular movements, charismatic young leaders, dramatic journeys, maritime disasters, the slave trade, the suggestion of divine intervention or its absence. These were the elements of a narrative that even the most austere chronicler could not entirely suppress his interest in. The Children's Crusade gets more detailed treatment in more different sources than many events of far greater official historical significance, simply because it was the kind of story that demanded to be told. Discomfort because they did not know what to do with it theologically. The problem at the heart of the Children's Crusade, from a medieval theological perspective, was not the practical failure. Practical failure could be accommodated within the theological framework. God's ways were mysterious. Human sin was always capable of corrupting even the best intention. Suffering was redemptive. Martyrdom was honourable. The problem was the specific quality of the faith involved. These were not corrupt knights interested in land and plunder. These were not politically motivated monarchs using crusade as a vehicle for territorial expansion. These were poor children, motivated apparently by nothing except the purest possible religious impulse, walking toward Jerusalem because they believed God had called them there. The theological framework that explained the failure of earlier crusades by reference to the corruption of their participants was specifically and completely inapplicable here. And without that explanation, the chroniclers were left with a failure that their theology could not easily absorb. The most honest among them simply said so. They recorded their bewilderment. They noted the sincerity of the participants and the horror of the outcome, and left the gap between the two as a gap, unresolved, sitting in their chronicles like a wound that would not close. This honesty, this refusal to impose a tidy theological resolution on an event that resisted it, is one of the reasons the Children's Crusade continued to be discussed and debated long after most events of comparable scale had faded from active historical memory. The unresolved question at its centre kept it alive. The longer historical legacy of the Children's Crusade is complicated by the fact that it arrived at a pivotal moment in the entire crusading enterprise. 1212 was not the end of the Crusades. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, reached Egypt, briefly captured the port of Damietta, and then was forced to surrender it and retreat in 1221. The Sixth Crusade, led by the excommunicated Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, actually recovered Jerusalem in 1229 through negotiation rather than warfare. An outcome so theologically and politically anomalous that it satisfied almost no one and was reversed within 15 years. Subsequent crusades continued through the 13th century, each one more logistically complex and less spiritually compelling than the last, until the fall of Acre in 1291 ended the Crusader presence in the Holy Land entirely. But the crusading movement after 1212 was different from the crusading movement before it. Not entirely because of the Children's Crusade, the failures of the Second and Third Crusades and the catastrophic misdirection of the Fourth had already done significant damage to the movement's moral authority. But the Children's Crusade contributed something specific to that damage. It demonstrated, in the most visceral possible way, the gap between the popular religious imagination that powered crusading enthusiasm and the institutional, military, commercial and political reality that determined crusading outcomes. The gap had always existed. The children of 1212 simply made it impossible to look away from. After 1212, the crusading movement increasingly became the province of professional armies, political calculations, papal diplomacy, and commercial financing. The popular dimension, the spontaneous mass uprising of ordinary people responding to a preacher's call, never again achieved the scale or the intensity of the First Crusade's Deus Vult moment. It never again moved tens of thousands of people off their farms and out of their workshops and onto the roads leading south and east. Whether the Children's Crusade killed that popular enthusiasm directly, or whether it was simply one symptom among many of a popular enthusiasm that was already exhausting itself against the reality of a Holy Land that would not be reclaimed by faith alone, is a question historians continue to debate. What is not debated is that the emotional landscape of the crusading movement was different after 1212, more cautious, more cynical, more aware, at the popular level if not always at the institutional level, of the cost of that particular form of belief. Modern historians have approached the Children's Crusade with a set of tools and questions that medieval chroniclers did not have, and the picture they have constructed is considerably more complex than the popular image of innocent children marching to their doom. The first major revision concerns who actually participated. As we have discussed throughout this account, the movements of 1212 were not composed exclusively or even primarily of young children in the modern sense of that phrase. The Latin word pueri, used in the sources to describe the participants, did not have a fixed age meaning. It could refer to children, to adolescents, to young men, to social subordinates of any age, or simply to people of low status. The image of 6- and 8-year-olds marching toward Jerusalem, which has dominated popular representations of the Children's Crusade since the 19th century, is almost certainly a significant distortion of the demographic reality. What the movements actually represented, the historical consensus now suggests, was something more like a pauperers' crusade. A crusade of the poor, in which youth was one defining characteristic among several, and social marginality was probably the more fundamental one. The participants were predominantly young, yes, but they were predominantly poor, predominantly male, predominantly from the rural peasant class, predominantly without property or prospects. These characteristics overlapped and reinforced each other in ways that make it difficult to isolate age as the primary explanatory variable. This revision matters not because it diminishes the tragedy of what happened. Poor young adults sold into slavery are not less tragic than poor young children sold into slavery, but because it changes what the movements were about. A crusade of children, in the modern sense, is primarily a story about innocence exploited. A crusade of the poor is primarily a story about structural inequality and the desperation it generates, about what happens when the people at the bottom of a hierarchical society are given a compelling promise by the people above them, and then left to absorb the consequences when the promise fails. The second major revision concerns the question of whether the movements happened at all in the form the sources describe. A minority of historians, most prominently the German scholar Peter Reitz, in an influential 1977 article, argued that the Children's Crusade as traditionally described is largely a later medieval construction, that there were popular religious movements in 1212, but that they were not specifically crusading in intent, not specifically composed of children, and not specifically connected to the slave ship disaster that the main sources describe. Under this view, the story as we know it is essentially a legend that crystallized around a real but much more modest kernel of historical fact. The majority of historians have not accepted Reitz's most radical conclusions. The convergence of independent sources, French, German, English and Italian chronicles, that do not appear to have been derived from a single common source, on the basic outlines of the story suggests a real historical event rather than a legend with no historical foundation. But the revisionist challenge has been productive in forcing a more careful reading of the sources and a more honest acknowledgement of where the evidence is solid and where it is not. What emerges from this more careful reading is a story that is simultaneously less dramatic and more historically significant than the popular version. Less dramatic because the specific details, the 30,000 at Venmae, the 7 ships, the named slave ports, cannot be verified with the confidence that popular accounts imply. More historically significant because the real story, stripped of its most legendary elements, is a story about structural forces, poverty, faith, institutional failure, commercial exploitation, that are not specific to 1212, but are specific to a particular kind of world, and a particular kind of relationship between that world's institutions and its most vulnerable people. There is a question that this story raises, and that I want to sit with directly, because it is the question that I think explains why the Children's Crusade has never stopped being told and retold across 8 centuries. The question is, what do we do with faith that leads people to disaster? Not faith that is cynical or manipulative or self-serving. The faith of the people who followed Stephen and Nicholas was, as far as the sources allow us to judge, genuine. These were not people who were pretending to believe in order to gain something. They were people who believed with a completeness and an intensity that moved their bodies across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, that sustained them through heat and hunger and the failure of expected miracles, that made them board ships offered by strangers because the ships seemed like God's provision, and that faith led them into the hands of slave traders. The easy response to this, the response that medieval chroniclers mostly settled for, and that a certain kind of modern secular reading also reaches for, is that the faith was misplaced, that Stephen and Nicholas were wrong, or deluded, or manipulated, and that the lesson of the Children's Crusade is the danger of uncritical belief. Put your faith in proper institutions. Listen to proper authorities. Do not follow boys with letters from Christ. This response is not wrong exactly. The practical advice it implies, be cautious, verify, do not board ships offered by strangers for free, is sound enough. But it does not fully reckon with what the faith actually was, and what the alternative to it looked like for the people who had it. The alternative to Stephen's faith for a 12-year-old French peasant in 1212 was not secular skepticism or critical thinking or institutional trust. It was the life of a French peasant in 1212. The mud and the cold and the hunger and the 40-year lifespan, and the absolute certainty that nothing was going to change. The faith was not a departure from rationality. It was a response to conditions that rationality alone offered no way out of. This is the thing about the Children's Crusade that resists simple moral framing. The faith that led these children into disaster was the same faith that made their lives bearable. That gave their suffering meaning. That connected them to something larger than the grinding particularity of peasant existence in early 13th century France. You cannot cleanly separate the faith that boarded the ships from the faith that got people through the winters. What you can separate, what the story insists you separate, once you look at it honestly, is the faith of the participants from the institutions and individuals who exploited it. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig did not create the faith. They found it, already existing, already enormous, already moving toward the sea, and they turned it into a commercial transaction. The Church did not create the specific desperate popular piety that generated the movements of 1212. It had spent a century cultivating crusading enthusiasm, and had then left the popular version of that enthusiasm without adequate institutional support, guidance, or protection, and had then watched from a cautious distance when the predictable result occurred. The children were not failed by their faith. They were failed by the world their faith was moving through. This distinction between the faith and the world is, I think, why the story has retained its power across 8 centuries of telling and retelling. It maps onto something that is not specific to medieval France or medieval Germany or the specific theological context of 1212. Every generation has its version of the moment when a genuine and sincere and human impulse toward something better, toward justice, toward meaning, toward the transcendent, toward community, toward purpose, collides with the specific cold realities of the world it is moving through. Every generation has its version of the ships that went the wrong way. Every generation has its Hugh the Iron and its William the Pig, waiting on the docks with offers that sound like provision and turn out to be exploitation. The medieval frame makes these things legible in a specific way. The religious language, the miracle that did not come, the sea that did not part. These are not just historical details. They are the universal grammar of disappointed hope, dressed in the specific vocabulary of a world that expressed everything through faith. When we say the sea did not part for Stephen's followers, we are saying something that translates directly across 8 centuries into any language and any context in which people have moved towards something they believed was going to change everything, and found instead that the sea was just the sea. This is why the story will not stay in the past, why historians keep returning to it, why it generated the Pied Piper myth and 100 other echoes in European cultural memory, why it still produces a specific sensation in the chest when you follow it all the way through, not shock exactly, not surprise, but something more like recognition, the painful recognition of a pattern you have seen before, in other forms, in other times, that human beings keep walking into, because the alternative to walking toward the promised miracle is standing still in the mud, and standing still in the mud is its own kind of death. The town of Hamelin still marks the anniversary of the Pied Piper every year. The street through which legend says the children departed, the Bungalowsenstrasse, the street without drums, is still a place where music is traditionally not played, where celebrations are muted, as if the absence of sound is a form of mourning for children who left so long ago that nobody alive remembers them, but who are still, somehow, not entirely gone. The Church of the Holy Innocents was built in Marseille in memory of the children of the French movement. Its history is complicated and its current form is much later than 1212, but the impulse behind it, the need to mark the place where the ships left, to name the loss, to give it a form that could be visited and touched, that impulse is very old and very human, and says something about what communities do when they lose their children to something they cannot fully understand. In the villages of the Loire Valley and the Rhineland, there are no memorials, there are no plaques. The specific children who left those specific villages in the summer of 1212 left no names in the historical record. They were not important enough in the eyes of the people who kept records to be named. They were pueri, the poor young ones, the children, the followers, the crowd. They existed in the historical record as a mass rather than as individuals. But they were individuals. Each one of them was a specific person with a specific face and a specific voice and a specific moment of decision. The moment when they heard the preaching and felt something move in them and put down whatever they were carrying and began to walk. Each one of them had a family that watched them go. Each one of them had a version of the faith that was entirely their own, shaped by their specific experience of hunger and cold and the religious culture they had been born into. We do not know their names. We cannot recover their individual stories. The record does not contain them. What it contains is the shape they left, the outline of a movement, the trace of thousands of pairs of feet on the summer roads of France and Germany, the echo of voices raised in hymns that nobody wrote down, the silence where they should have come home. History is full of silences like this, full of events that happened to people who did not have the power to ensure their stories were recorded, whose lives and deaths were noted only in the margins of accounts focused on the powerful, the institutional, the officially significant. The Children's Crusade is unusual not because its participants were poor and young and largely anonymous, that is true of most people who have ever lived, but because the event itself was dramatic enough and disruptive enough to the official narrative of crusading piety that it forced its way into the record despite the social insignificance of the people involved. The monks who wrote about it were not writing about it for the children's sake. They were writing about it because it raised questions about the church, about the Crusades, about the relationship between popular faith and institutional authority, that their professional obligations required them to engage with. The children got into the historical record because they were useful evidence in a debate that was really about something else. And yet here we are, 800 years later, and the thing that we remember, the thing that has lasted, is not the institutional debate, it is the children. The specific, irreducible, heartbreaking image of young people walking toward the sea in the belief that God was going to do something impossible, and the sea being just the sea. The institutional questions are settled, more or less. The Crusades failed. The Church reformed. The feudal world that produced the conditions for the Children's Crusade dissolved over centuries into the world we inhabit now. The specific theological anxieties that gave Stephen's message its power are the province of historians and medievalists, not of most people's daily experience. But the children are still walking in the imagination, in the cultural memory, in the specific quality of feeling this story generates when you follow it all the way through. They are still walking down the summer roads of France toward a sea that is not going to part, and something in us walks with them, recognizing something, feeling the specific weight of a hope that the world is not going to honour. If you are still awake, I hope it is because the story held you rather than because sleep refused to come. And if you drifted off somewhere in the fields outside Vendemy, or on the Alpine passes with Nicholas, or standing on the docks at Marseille watching the ships go, then I hope the story accompanied you gently into wherever sleep took you. This is what history does when it is given the time and the quiet to do it properly. It does not stay in the past. It travels. It moves through the centuries and arrives in the present still carrying the specific weight of the specific people it is about. Their faith and their hunger and their extraordinary, ordinary, heartbreaking humanity. The children of 1212 did not get their miracle. The sea did not part. The ships went the wrong way. They walked all that way for nothing, or for everything, depending on how you measure what a human life lived in full commitment to something larger than itself is worth. I leave that question with you. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through history, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to like the video and subscribe to Just About History. These stories take a long time to find and a long time to tell, and every like and every subscription is what makes it possible to keep telling them. And drop your location and your local time in the comments below. If you are still awake and would love to keep this peaceful journey going, you can let the next video play, slipping smoothly into another corner of history as you close your eyes. So put down whatever is keeping you up. Let your shoulders drop. Let the story settle. Have a good night's sleep.